Computer. Okay. Hello, everyone. This is, I believe, our 14th episode of Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord. And I think pretty much everybody here already knows where we're at, so I'm just going to plunge right in. At our last meeting, we got part of the way through. We had two chapters. One chapter was called Time and History, which is like about history. And the shorter chapter where we're in the middle of is called Spectacular Time. And this is sort of modern time that has become sort of commodified and artificialized in various ways. And so these theses that we're in are talking about this kind of modern time. So I'll pick up with 155. While the consumption of cyclical time in ancient societies was consistent with the real labor of those societies, the pseudo-cyclical consumption of developed economies contradicts the abstract, irreversible time implicit in their system of production. Cyclical time was the really lived time of unchanging illusions. Spectacular time is the illusorily lived time of a constantly changing reality. That's pretty dense. We'll be coming back to that, but I'm going to move on. The production process's constant innovations are not echoed in consumption, which presents nothing but an expanded repetition of the past. Because dead labor continues to dominate living labor, in spectacular time, the past continues to dominate the present. So dead labor is like what's been built up in the past, but has kind of rigidified. And so we in the present, including workers in the present, are laboring or doing various things. But what we're doing is dominated by that sort of rigidified leftover or accumulation of the past. So by the same token that the labor is like that, our time is like that. To go back to that one opening thing I read, in old cyclical time, like thousands of years ago in primitive societies or not very developed societies, people would have this cyclical time, and it really, that's how it was pretty much. The year came around and, things repeated. And except for the few people on the surface, which were sort of like the masters, things really didn't change very much. And even if things changed on the surface, like one society conquered another or a new ruler took over or something like that, the most people underneath were just going around doing the same stuff. So it really was time was a cycle that just repeated pretty much. So he's saying that time was really lived time, such as it was. That was how they lived. But it was a time of unchanging illusions. Nothing changed, but the things that didn't change was like mythologies and, they didn't really know what was, they had these illusions and those illusions persisted. Whereas in modern cyclical time, spectacular time, in modern time, he calls it pseudo-cyclical time. We have this sort of time that we live in that goes from week to weekend and, regular time to vacation time and various other cycles. But we're living in it in an illusory way. We're not really living in it like primitive people lived in cyclical time. They were really there. We're living in this time that has just become spectacularized, parcelized, It's not what we think it is, and so on. But on the other hand, the time that we are living in is a constantly changing reality. So so going on with 157. The lack of general historical life, in other words, that genuinely historical life would be life that is changing according to how people make it. But what we're living is the image of that. Like we think, oh, all this stuff is happening, but we aren't doing it. What's doing it is the economy, the spectacle. And we're just kind of passing through it, and we can look on TV and say, oh, I need that. I can go on a vacation there. I can go there to spend some time. But it's all commodified. Uh, so we don't have historical life going on, except for rare exceptions. This also means that individual life as yet has no history. The pseudo events that vie for attention in spectacular dramatizations have not been lived by those who are informed about them. And in any case, they are soon forgotten due to their increasingly frenetic replacement at every pulsation of the spectacular machinery. Again, just to simplistically say you're watching something on TV or hearing about something, you may see events that sound, wow, that's really, look at what's going on there. Something got exploded. Somebody was assassinated. Somebody made a new record in sports, or there's a, political, struggle or something. And we think, wow, this stuff is really going on here. But much of that is what Debord, picking up on this guy who wrote the image, called pseudo events. They're an event that sounds like it's a big deal, but it's kind of contrived. I mean, an obvious example of pseudo events say, hey, it's the 8th anniversary of blah, 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 so as if this was some momentous thing. Uh, I mean, even if the original thing was momentous, maybe it's the anniversary of the American Revolution or the Civil War or something. It's those events, or maybe we see a James Bond film or, some kind of adventure. Uh, there's all these adventurous, exciting things happen, but we haven't lived them. We're just informed about them. This thing has happened, or this, and in any case, even if we do identify with them or something, then they just go. They are soon forgotten due to their increasingly frenetic replacement day after day at every pulsation of the spectacular machinery. The news or all these other things are just grinding out this stuff, and they're constantly making supposed new things come forth. Conversely, what is really lived in our actual lives has no relation to society's official version of irreversible time and clashes with the pseudo-cyclical rhythm of that time's consumable byproducts. This individual experience of a disconnected everyday life remains without language, without concepts, and without critical access to its own past, which has nowhere been recorded. If we read history books or if we learn something in school about what happened, we don't learn about that. We learn about these dramatic events that may or may not have been significant. Uncommunicated, misunderstood, and forgotten, it is smothered by the spectacle's false memory of the unmemorable. The spectacle, considered as the reigning society's method for paralyzing history and memory, and for suppressing any history based on historical time, represents a false consciousness of time. In order to force the workers into the status of free producers and consumers of commodified time, it was first necessary to violently expropriate their time. The imposition of the new spectacular form of time became possible only after this initial dispossession of the producers. Now, here he's obviously taking off on the Marxian thing from the 19th century, where Marx talks about where did the workers come from that are willing to work in a factory for 18 hours a day? It's a completely ridiculous thing. How do people get convinced to do that? Well, it's because they wouldn't have been convinced to do that as long as they had their own livelihood, like if they were raising their own food, however minimal it might be. Nobody's going to convince them to come into town in a factory and work much more. Da, da, da. So the reason that are convinced to do that is that their land and their tools and other related things were stolen from them. Land that they used to, you know, find fruit and do hunt in or whatever, fish in and so on, is say, no, this isn't your property. It's Lord so-and-so's property. You can be, hung if you trespass on this. So now they are without any property. They can't raise their own food. They can't go hunting. That's poaching, which is all in England was a capital offense. It was a death penalty offense. A lot of things like that. So Marx talked about that in Capital. He's saying these commons or these things have been expropriated, and then that forces them into a situation where they have nothing except to sell their labor to some owner of a factory or whatever. So Debord is making an analogous thing here. He's saying there's these two kind of times, and the imposition of this artificial commodified time that we've just been talking about here could not have happened until the people at the workers or people in general were robbed of their initially lived time. However screwed up that lived time may have been in earlier societies, there was a point at which they lived that time. They were there, and that time had to be taken from them. And so it's kind of went along with their land being taken from them or their, et cetera. So I'm going to just pause there for any questions or comments. Yes, Gerhard, unmute yourself.
A friend is approaching me, that's all.
Oh, okay. Okay, say hi to your friend. Any questions there? Peter?
Just want a kind of a comment on the possibility of actually recognizing lived time. Some of the protest movements that I've been lucky enough to be part of, like Occupy Wall Street or the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, felt like you could almost see. I mean, they weren't exactly seizing control of your lived historical experience, but you could kind of see in the debates of the different occupies, like, what could we do with the future, right? We're all sitting around trying to figure out what to do. And there's like a little glimmer there. And then I think in 2020, there was a little bit of a, well, how do we change society that was just happening everywhere? And so there's that like possibility at different points that you can kind of see. And it's so different from, well, like you said, like these fake kind of pseudo-cyclical events that are just coming back and forth. This was really like, hey, no, we can actually make a dent in the police state.
That's
and we're
right.
going to do it,
Yeah, that in other words, this is another angle to look at that. We could talk about time, different kind of time. We could also talk about it different relations or different relations to your activity or something. But so yes, thanks for bringing that up. Mike, unmute yourself.
Just a comment about my reading of Capital is that dead time as a concept came up to me when I first read The Situationist, but then I was also struck by the comparison with the congealed or crystallized labor time in the product that Marx's analysis is concentrating on in terms of the commodity, the product of the labor, like the commons. It was a possession. And you lost it through the social relation of wage labor. That's a crucial observation that Marx makes, that it's it turns into this abstraction called socially necessary labor time, which is an average, a quantity, but it's actually, if that labor time isn't congealed in some qualitative thing or service, then it has no substance, and the alienation of that substance from the worker's control is essential in terms of understanding how the wage system relates to political power, because who does own it? It's the employing class, the capitalist class, and eventually the landlords, and everybody else owns all this wealth that we're creating, but we don't actually own it.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll shut up.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on here. Number 160 is a longish thesis here. Let's see, we'll stop there. Or no, not stop the video. The unavoidable biological limitations of the workforce, evident both in its dependence on the natural cycle of sleeping and waking, and in the debilitating effects of irreversible time over each individual's lifetime, are treated by the modern production system as strictly secondary. These biological limitations, like that you die or you get sick or something. As such, they are ignored in that system's official proclamations and in the consumable trophies that embody its relentless, triumphant progress. Fixated on the delusory center around which his world seems to move, the spectator no longer experiences life as a journey toward fulfillment and toward death. Once he has given up on really living, he can no longer acknowledge his own death. Life insurance ads merely insinuate that he may be guilty of dying without having provided for the smooth continuation of the system following the resultant economic loss. While the promoters of the American Way of Death, which was the name of a book from a few decades ago about the funeral industry in America, stress his capacity to preserve most of the appearances of life in his post-mortem state. On all other fronts of advertising bombardment, it is strictly forbidden to grow old. They don't talk about it even. Everybody is urged to economize on their youth capital. It's valuable, folks. Though such capital, however carefully managed, has little prospect of attaining the durable and cumulative properties of financial capital. This social absence of death coincides with the social absence of life. 161. As Hegel showed, time is the necessary alienation, the terrain where the subject realizes himself by losing himself, becomes other in order to become truly himself. In total contrast, the current form of alienation is imposed on the producers of an estranged present. In this spatial alienation, the society that radically separates the subject from the activity it steals from him is in reality separating him from his own time. This potentially surmountable social alienation is what has prevented and paralyzed the possibilities and risks of a living alienation within time. This is another rather difficult thesis that we'll get into, but I think I'll finish this chapter and then we'll come back to that. Behind the fashions that come and go on the frivolous surface of the spectacle of pseudo-cyclical time, the grand style of an era can always be found in what is governed by the secret yet obvious necessity for revolution. The natural basis of time, the concrete experience of its passage, becomes human and social by existing for humanity. The limitations of human practice imposed by the various stages of labor have humanized time and also dehumanized it in the form of cyclical time and of the separated, irreversible time of economic production. The revolutionary project of a classless society, of an all-embracing historical life, implies the withering away of the social measurement of time in favor of a federation of independent times, a federation of playful individual and collective forms of irreversible time that are simultaneously present. This would be the temporal realization of authentic communism, which, quote, abolishes everything that exists independently of individuals. The last thesis, the world already dreams of such a time. In order to actually live it, it only needs to become fully conscious of it. So we'll pause there. So before we talk about the death thing there, which is an amusing thesis, I want to try to explain a little bit what's going on in number 161. There are a word like alienation is sort of has some synonyms, and all of them have some ambiguities about it. A common synonym is estrangement. And there are other synonyms in there. The original sense of the word alienation, as I understand it, is that something has been taken from you. So if a worker is alienated, he or she, there are various ways that it may be that the worker is making something, but it doesn't belong to him. I'm going to just use the masculine things for simplicity here. So he's alienated from the product of his labor because for some reason or another, this other person owns it, even though the worker himself did it. He's also alienated from his own activity because he didn't decide to do this. Somebody said, you do that. I'm paying you to do this. Go do this thing on that machine there or whatever. So his activity is not his. It belongs to somebody else. He's also, because of this, alienated from his peers, his other workers there, because each of them have that same relationship to the boss or to the owner. And each of them may therefore be competing with each other. Like this person will work for less money. And so I got to, or there's various competition, it's not like he's buddies there. And I don't know, there's one or two other, anyway, there's other sort of nuances where you're losing something. And estrangement is similar, maybe not exactly the same thing. It means like you're in some situation where you meet a person, but you're estranged from them, it means that you're not buddies with them, you're not close with them or something. There's some antagonism there. So that's kind of like alienation. And another word is objectification. Like you do something and it becomes an object. And sometimes that could be a way of describing alienation. You create something, but the thing you create is like this alien object that, may be something that you don't like, or that is, you may create a gun that will kill you, for example, or something like that. So in Hegel, as well as Marx, these kind of things are in there and what they're talking about. And so what Debord is doing here is that he's pointing out that in Hegel, and similarly by implication in Marx and Debord and so on, all alienations are not necessarily bad, if you use that term, or let's say objectifications or something. You can make something that is then an object, and it's not necessarily alien to you. Maybe it's an object, you make a cake and then you eat the cake. Nothing alien there, etc. You can think of other examples. So I won't go further into that, except to say, so Debord is pointing out that Hegel in certain places said that time is something where automatically it's the necessary alienation, things do change. You can't hold on to time and say, don't change, I want to hold on to it. Time is moving and you're moving with it. But Hegel is saying, according to Debord, looking at it in this sense, that even though those things are changing, that is consistent with you being a free, fulfilled individual. That's how the world works. Your fulfillment is not that you just stay the same all the time. Time is the field in which you can realize yourself, and that includes moving toward your death or moving toward changes where your friends die or you get sick or something. All these changes happen, but that's the field where we can also realize itself. We can't get away from that. It's the train where the subject realizes himself by losing himself because he's different at each moment, etc., becomes other in order to become truly himself. So that's you could write a whole book about that, and people have done that. In total contrast, though, the current form of alienation that Debord has been talking about, spectacular alienation, is imposed on the producers of an estranged present. You're right in the middle of something, but you're estranged. It's a spatial alienation. And so he's kind of leading up to the next chapter, which is about space instead of time. The society that radically separates the subject from the activity it steals from him is in reality separating from his own time. But you could also say, as we'll see, it's also separating him in space, so that space is alien to him, or he's separated spatially from somebody. So then, okay, I think I'll stop there. Any comments or questions about these last few theses? Yes, Mike.
Just one observation is that in my own personal life is that I first ran into that particular sort of notion when I read Lukasz's History and Class Consciousness, where he brings up the reversal of the subject-object relationship. And what he meant by that was what Debord is talking about. The reversal is that the object becomes the power, and one of the great things I learned from Lukács was the concept of reification, that you actually that the objects that you create become the power over you, and you create them. And why do you do that? It's something that happens in the mind. You reverse the subject-object relationship, and that's precisely what Marx is trying to get at in the fetishism of commodities. But yeah, that's a great observation, but it's really hard to get across to people. I don't understand why, but it is.
Yeah. Thank you. Peter.
Yeah, the section of 163 where he talks about the Federation of Independent Times has always struck me as really important when I read this work. And thinking about what he's saying here, just that capitalism needs one measurement of time so they can figure out how much surplus value they're taking from workers. But when you don't have that, you can set up your society or your little community however you want, right? It makes me think of like William Morris. Some people might want to go back to a more archaic way of living, cyclical, be much more in tune with nature. Other people might want to do something much more futuristic. And you could make a decision based on your own community as to what's going to work for you. You want to work more and play less, but build like a space age society, or you want to go back to nature. And there's nothing is forcing you to do one or the other, but you can still be, you can have a relationship between communities that's pretty equal. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, that's what I talked about last time when I read that little part from Joy of Revolution, that I think there's that all kinds of different possibilities, and they don't preclude each other. Once we sort of get over the hump of some of these things that we're stuck with now, Thank you. Bill Florin. You need to unmute yourself, Bill. Okay. Bill, if you can hear me, try just, instead of looking for a button, try pushing the space button down and holding it. Okay, just hold it there.
Yeah, no, I was holding the space button.
And that was future reference, you can always do that if you're unclear about unmuting yourself. You can temporarily unmute yourself just by holding down the space bar. And then when you lift it up, you're muted again. So go ahead, Bill.
Yeah. I was wondering about this federation of playful, individual, and collective forms. Is that in the spirit of what we read about Derives? And does anybody go on Derives nowadays?
Yes and yes. Definitely, Derive was a kind of playful activity, an experimental activity where you're sort of making up your own rules. You're having your adventure. And yes, actually, nowadays, one of the somewhat superficial, but not entirely superficial effect of the Situationists was to popularize that kind of thing. And so there are actually all over the world, there are people that have groups, and they've practically written books about it. They have explorations of their cities. They play games with cities that are a little bit more surrealistic rather than Derives, but like you pull out something at random and that says go to that intersection and talk with the first person you see, or it's infinite possibilities, and there are people that do that.
Has it been written up? Has anybody written up
if you go online and search the word psychogeography as one word, you will find a ton of stuff like that. There's a whole lot of it in England, but there are people in New York, there are people in Australia, it's all over the place. You'll find groups that debate that, or simply that do that. And it can be debated, like, is that really what Debord was doing or not? Well, probably not exactly, but, it's somewhat in the same nature. The main difference is that when Debord and Stegloff and people like that were doing it in the early 50s, it really was an adventure. Nobody else was doing it. They didn't know where it was going to lead. And it had an element of danger in it, even, you know, because part of the thing, they may end up in a very dubious part of town or something where there's the risks, or they anyway, but their idea was that they were scouting the terrain, namely the terrain of this world, and in particular, cities of this world, the urban terrain, to see what's going on there. What interesting things can we do now? But also, just what do we find? It can also have an element of surveying, like a scientific thing. You know, you're finding, we explored this neighborhood. What did we find? Well, we find that this thing is repellent. This thing was kind of intriguing. We've noted that people, when they get to this sort of intersection, tend to do blah, blah, blah. Or when we went to this neighborhood, it was depressing. Why? Not just because it was ugly, because we might have gone to a richer area and be even more depressed or something. You know, so go back to the definition, it's about the psychological, emotional effects of the environment on people.
Maybe how you're interacting with the spectacle on the ground.
Yeah, and what you're doing is you're kind of disorienting yourself. I like some of my friends back in around 1972 or 3. I wasn't on this particular one, but they said, "Oh, yesterday we did a sort of derive." They didn't, and what they did is that they went to the financial district in San Francisco without any motive. And they were there, you know, kind of wandering around like a person coming from Mars, like, what's going on here? And everybody else around them, yeah, had motives. They had to get back from their lunch hour, or they were sweating because they were stressing out of this, or they had lost some money in the stock market, or yeah, you know, whatever it might have been. Whereas they just went into some of these buildings and went up to the 14th floor or something, and then strolled down the hall, you know, without any notion of we were going somewhere. They're just kind of looking around. And because they had no motives, it was a very exciting, interesting outing. Whereas normally you would think, well, that's not a very interesting place to go, or, you know, what are you going to do there? Well, what they were doing is they were kind of playing with themselves, just like taking LSD or something, you know, and seeing what happened. So when you do something like that, what happens is that you look at the buildings and the streets and the decor and all that a little differently. You say, when you are in the mode of adventure or exploration, you look at that and you say, what in the world is that bullshit doing there? You don't take it for, whereas we just walk down the street and we think, oh, of course, there's these skyscrapers and there's the banks there and there's the stores there and all that. And that's normal. But if you look at it in another way, that's not normal. It's really bizarre. And so that's a first step in kind of deprogramming yourself so that you can then come back from your journey a few hours later and say, what was that like? Or what did you think? Did you have the same feeling I did about blah, blah, blah? It's not like, I mean, it's too simplistic to say, well, it could be different, but that's part of it. In other words, you don't assume that a city has to be a lot of streets with a lot of tall buildings with parking lots and, you know, ATMs and whatever else. You're looking at it like from the standpoint sort of a free person. which most of us are not most of the time. And so that's, by doing that, you then, the people that did that, like Debord, within the next few years, are people that came up with extremely inventive, insightful critiques of that kind of society. And it would be hard to do that if you're taking for granted that a city looks like this or a city is supposed to be like that. That a city is just a place to get around in. And so you think, well, to get around, the automobiles are good for that, you know, so then you need streets and you need parking lots and you need gas stations and you need this. And that's kind of how I see that. Anyway, look up psychogeography in Google and you will find a ton of stuff on that. So Judy, unmute yourself. You're muted.
When I worked for the Carpenters Union in the 2000s, especially after 9/11, and I think after there was that shooting at that high rise on California Street, which was before that, a few years before that, people had free access to those buildings. But now you have to show a driver's
Right.
license, you have to leave a driver's license. And some of those buildings, you know, like that Lucas building in the Presidio, even if they give you admission, you'll get a card and you can go to the 3rd floor, but your card will not let you go to the 4th floor.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's very different now.
Yeah, exactly. This is a good point, and the Situationists, of course, totally pointed that out. That these tendencies are there, so that things they could do in the 50s, and even that my friends could do in the 70s, you couldn't do now. So we have to find other ways to derive if you're going to derive. Ed Stress.
I've noticed this along the years that some of us are explorers and like to um, go to places that people like us are not there. And in a way, in a very bizarre way, we sort of bulletproof the system by showing them their. We kind of, my group kind of says, yeah, look, we can get in here, and to show them the fallacy of their thought control that you can't go there. But in effect, what it does is we have send in harmless bulletproofers, and they'll find, oh, people can get in here. Maybe they shouldn't. We'll lock it up, and then we have a little industry that comes in and makes locks and makes security and shuts us out.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's an inverse effect of this kind of exploration. I don't know what good it does, actually, except
Well, what good it does is for the people doing it.
right. It gives you the feeling of freedom, but then it closes down. It spends that freedom. If
Yeah,
we're
but the fact that the buildings get locked up later on is trivial. The point is not that we need to explore those buildings. It's just that those things, and nowadays people do that probably more digitally, and I don't want to go in, you know, there's other ways that we can do things that are sort of out of the norm. But the point is that Debord and these people in those early days were seeking adventure, but also seeking clarification. You know, what is here? It's like an exploration. So I want to move on to the next chapter.
Ken,
Yes,
Ken, before you move on, a
please.
couple of things.
Mhm.
I think we lost Gerhardt's words of wisdom when a odd fellow greeted him. And also Ed Barcelon has an interesting thing in the chat about time in
Okay.
Debord versus Greek time. Could you please address those two?
Okay. Thank you. So let's see where we get here. Could spectacular time and non-spectacular time be related to chronos versus kairos, or repetitive quantity versus? I'm not familiar with those times, but your description sounds like they could, that it's sort of those things. There's one time that's kind of mechanical, quantitative, repetitive, and there's another time which is qualitative. It's like new things happen in each moment, and it doesn't go backwards. So yes. And Gerhard, I don't know. We'll see when he comes back here if he had something that we want to hear about. So this next chapter, 7, is called Territorial Management, and here's the epigraph for that. It's from Machiavelli's The Prince, where he's advising rulers, or he's addressing rulers like, here is how, here's how you do it if you want to keep power. And so he's warning a ruler, whoever becomes the ruler of a city, just a minute here, of a city that is accustomed to freedom and does not destroy it, does not destroy that city, can expect to be destroyed by it. For it, that city, can always find a pretext for rebellion in the name of its former freedom and age-old customs, which are never forgotten despite the passage of time or any benefits it has received from the new ruler. No matter what the ruler does or what precautions he takes, the inhabitants will never forget that freedom or those customs unless they are separated or dispersed. That last phrase is the key thing here. Because that is exactly what we're going to see happen in this short chapter. 165. Capitalist production has unified space, breaking down the boundaries between one society and the next. This unification is at the same time an extensive and intensive process of banalization. Just as the accumulation of commodities mass-produced for the abstract space of the market shattered all regional and legal barriers and all the medieval guild restrictions that maintained the quality of craft production, it also undermined the autonomy and quality of places. This homogenizing power is the heavy artillery that has battered down all the walls of China. We can explain these things a little bit later. The free space of commodities, which is where we are, is constantly being modified and rebuilt in order to become ever more identical to itself, to get as close as possible to motionless monotony. While eliminating geographical distance, this society produces a new internal distance in the form of spectacular separation. Tourism, human circulation packaged for consumption, a byproduct of the circulation of commodities, is the opportunity to go and see what has been banalized. The economic organization of travel to different places already guarantees their equivalence. The modernization that has eliminated the time involved in travel has simultaneously eliminated any real space from it. I think this is all fairly, I'll just zip through it a little bit, where he talks about the walls of China in the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels talk about how the commodity or capitalism, trade, has battered down all the walls of China. China didn't want to be trading with the West and all that, but there were actual wars that happened, called the Opium Wars, among other things, to force China to trade. And similar thing happened with Japan. I mean, there were actually military boats that went in and said, you guys are going to trade with us. or else we're going to invade. And but it didn't have to be military, because once the commodity circulation and production is underway, it will just eat into any barrier that is up there. So he's saying that like the capitalism has broken down these barriers so that it's pretty much one world. I mean, when Debord was writing this, it was like two worlds, because there was the Iron Curtain, which was kind of hard to get through. But even so, if there was something, some commodity like the Beatles, or like a new kind of automobile or something, it got past the Iron Curtain, even though the Russian rulers didn't want it there, it filtered in. And so a little bit later, then Russia starts having to make Levi's because they're so popular. So they make an official Russian state version of Levi's, so that they can kind of co-opt this thing. Anyway, that's what's been going on in the last few centuries. And Debord is saying this is really heavy duty going on in this current century, the 20th. So while eliminating geographical distance, because we have more rapid transit, transportation, effectively, we are not very far from India or China now, whereas it used to be, to go there, you'd have to spend half a year or something, and all this. Now, if you have a little bit of money, it doesn't even take that much. You can get there in 12 hours or something. But by the same token, even though it's eliminated that geographical distance, it's created an internal distance where we are separated. We can be 10 feet away from somebody in a cafe or on a assembly line or various other places, and we're like a million miles away from that person, So, and tourism, the example where I'm going to, just a minute here. Let's see. I'm going to mute everybody because I'm hearing, yeah, you can unmute yourself, but I'm hearing some background noise. So with tourism, same idea. We can now go to places that were really super exotic in the 19th century or 18th century, something like that. Even though a few things may be a little more difficult, maybe we would have a hard time going to Tibet or something, but most places in the world we could go to. But the fact that everybody can go to these places means that by the time we get there, we go to a hotel, the hotel is identical to the hotel in San Francisco or London. And we may go out and find, okay, it does look a little different. The people look a little different. They're doing different stuff, but pretty much they may be wearing the Levi's, that you used to only find in the United States, a baseball cap that says "Hooray for Michael Jordan," or you're not really getting away from it all by the same token. So the society that reshapes its entire surroundings has evolved its own special technique for molding its very territory, which constitutes the material underpinning for all the facets of this project. Urbanism, or city planning is another name for the same thing, is capitalism's method for taking over the natural and human environment. Following its logical development toward total domination, capitalism now can and must refashion the totality of space into its own particular decor. And it's done that pretty much. The capitalist need that is satisfied by urbanism's conspicuous petrification of life can be described in Hegelian terms, he's quoting from Hegel here, as a total predominance of peaceful coexistence within space over, quote, the restless becoming that takes place in the progression of time, unquote. So it's like spatial stuff is dominating over time, which is where change happens. So it kind of, there's this kind of dialectic between time and space going on here. While all the technical forces of capitalism contribute toward various forms of separation, urbanism provides the material foundation for those forces and prepares the ground for their deployment. It is the very technology of separation. And we're going to get very easy to understand examples of this. I mean, in urbanism, you're literally locked out, like Judy was talking about the big buildings now, or you can't go here because it's only freeways and there's no place to walk, or there's a wall that prevents you from going here, or you can go there, but you have to have an ID that says you're allowed to be here, et cetera, et cetera. You've got all that kind of stuff that this makes it real easy to understand. Very simply, you're separated from all this stuff. You can't go from point A to point B, usually. If you do go from point A to point B, you find that point B has already been made identical to point A anyways. So, you know, you haven't really gotten where you were wanting to go. So this next thesis brings this into historical time. Urbanism is the modern method for solving the ongoing problem of safeguarding class power by atomizing the workers who had been dangerously brought together by the conditions of urban production. We talked earlier about, you know, you had people who were peasants or lived in the forest or something, and they end up being forced to come to town and work in a factory. Okay, so that's great for the factory owners. They can work for practically nothing. I mean, they don't have to pay them much. They can work them 18 hours a day and say, if you don't like it, there's somebody else that'll take your place, all that. But by the time of Marx, where these things have become really pretty big things, you would have places like Manchester or Birmingham or something that were these huge factory after factory after factory. And, you know, in this town, you might have 500,000 workers, and they're all crammed in together like in a sardine can. And then when they go home, they're crammed into these dingy little dwelling places. Similarly, they're all crammed together. And so if they look around and say, oh, I can't stand this, I don't like this, they're with their fellows. They can say, yeah, this is bullshit. What can we do? And you have these beginnings of revolts. Like they say, well, what about if there's this thing called a labor union? Maybe we can do that. Or there's a thing called a strike and we can do that. Or we can. So this starts getting dangerous for the owners because the workers you don't have to rally the workers to meet for a march or something. They're already together 24/7 practically. So this is dangerous. So now urbanism, whether it's conscious about this or not, has to say we have to separate people so that we have to do something about this. If they're together, they can have uprisings like in 1848. And in 1848, when they had an uprising in Paris, and they sent in the army to crush it, the army had a lot of trouble because Paris had all these little windy alleys and stuff like that, you know, and people could drop stuff on them from the roofs and so on. And they had cannons and all this, but what good is a cannon doing in a curvy alley? And so what happened is those of you who have been to Paris, right during Marx's lifetime, we had this guy, Baron Hausmanns, who was hired or tapped by Emperor Napoleon III to do something to make Paris more accessible to the army so that you wouldn't have these little nooks and crannies. And so Haussmann tore down a lot of the city and built these huge boulevards. You say, wonder, what are these purpose of these boulevards? It's so that army can get through. I mean, that's the actual reason they were built. You know, nowadays you forget about it and you just say there's now cars are going, but back then they didn't need these big things for cars. Cars didn't exist. So that's what this is talking about. Dangerously brought together. The constant struggle that has had to be waged against anything that might lead to such coming together has found urbanism to be its most effective field of operation. The efforts of all the established powers since the experiences of the French Revolution to increase the means of maintaining law and order in the streets have finally culminated in the suppression of the streets. Describing what he terms a one-way system, Lewis Mumford, that's in this book, this is City and History, which is highly recommended. It's not something you need to rush right out and read, but it's really a good book. You know, I mean, you get a whole rounding of history, but with focusing on the cities and the different evolutions that they've gone through over the centuries. So Debord, that book had just come out a couple of years before Society of the Spectacle. So Debord was, he read it very carefully and he quotes it a few times in this chapter. So Mumford is saying that at a certain point you get a one-way system, which with the present means of long-distance mass communication, sprawling isolation has proved an even more effective method of keeping a population under control. So now they don't have to worry about sending in militias, you know, armies with cannons and stuff. You just keep everybody isolated and then they're pretty harmless. What can they do? I mean, they have to make a big effort even to gather in a small crowd, and then police can come in if they do. So, but the general trend toward isolation, which is the underlying essence of urbanism, must also include a controlled reintegration of the workers in accordance with the planned needs of production and consumption. You can't just send them all over the place, you know, where they have to commute 2 hours every day or something. It's not practical. So you have to have them integrated, but separated. This reintegration into the system means bringing isolated individuals together as isolated individuals. Factories, cultural centers, tourist resorts, and housing developments are specifically designed to foster this type of pseudo-community. The same collective isolation prevails even within the family cell, where the omnipresent receivers of spectacular messages fill the isolation with the dominant images. Images that derive their full power precisely from that isolation. If everybody was in a big stadium watching TV, say, it would still be kind of a weird thing while they're all watching this one thing. But everybody would look around and they could talk to their neighbors. And if there was something that seemed fishy, they could start booing and everybody could pick up the boo. Yeah, you know, there could still be something going on there. But if you're there with your wife or husband and kids and cat and dog watching a TV show, any kind of thing can come in, and what are you going to do about it? Zero. You can't do shit. You know, there's no, I mean, the best you can do is maybe you invite your neighbors in to watch, you know, the Super Bowl together or something, you know, and you've got a slight amount of communication for a temporary time. But, you know, this, like if you you can see that already most people, most of the time, are in these rather separated things, which render them completely harmless. There's nothing they can do except just sort of blandly complain, oh, I don't like that movie, or let's change the program. Okay, in all previous periods, architectural innovations were designed exclusively for the ruling classes, all these temples and famous things that we've seen. Now, for the first time, a new architecture has been designed specifically for the poor, not for the poor to buy, but for the poor to live in. The aesthetic poverty and vast proliferation of this new experience in habitation, very nicely weighed words there. He doesn't call it living, stem both from its function and from the modern conditions of construction. The obvious core of these conditions is the authoritarian decision-making, which abstractly converts the environment into an environment of abstraction. And we see that all around us. There may be exceptions in the more wealthy areas or something, but wherever we see things, buildings built just to sort of cram people into them so that they're not on the street, it's just ugly. I mean, they're indistinguishable, as the old Situationist leaflet from the 70s put it. The latest buildings are indistinguishable from the latest school buildings, which are indistinguishable from the latest factories, which are indistinguishable from the latest prisons. You know, it's just a big box with little sub boxes within it. And the notion of anything aesthetic is just a joke, like you plant a flower pot out in front or something, you know, or have a little bit of decorative lawn in front. But basically, that's what he's talking about. The same architecture appears everywhere as soon as industrialization has begun, even in the countries that are furthest behind in this regard, as an essential foundation for implanting the new type of social existence. So you'll find these same kind of things in some very primitive country, you know, in Africa or Asia or whatever, just because that's, as we don't usually see them, but like if you're flying and you go to airports, it doesn't matter where you are, the airport always looks the same. I mean, even the bathroom in the airport is the same wherever you go, and so on. And it's because whoever is in charge of that, it's not like they're sadistic exactly. They're not saying, let's make this as ugly as we can. They're just saying, hey, this is how it's done easily. You don't have to pay, you know, you can just duplicate that thing over here. Just build a box and put in this stuff, you know, and we already know how much it's going to cost. We can predict it, and you know, we know how many workers we need, and all this kind of thing. And so it ends up being the de facto thing that's just reproduced all around the world. So the only exceptions you get are where you're really rich people who have enough money to sort of still play around on their own. The contradiction between the growth of society's material powers and the continued lack of progress toward any conscious control of those powers is revealed as glaringly by the developments of urbanism as by the issues of thermonuclear weapons or genetic modification, where the possibility of manipulating heredity is already on the horizon. And this is 50 years ago. The self-destruction of the urban environment is already well underway. The explosion of cities into the countryside, covering it with what Mumford calls a, quote, formless mass of thinly spread semi-urban tissue, unquote, is directly governed by the imperatives of consumption. If you expand out there, you know, like everything is based around consumption. As soon as the houses have been built there, or the dwelling, the habitation units, let's say, the thing that goes right along with them is things like gigantic malls that he's going to talk about here. The dictatorship of the automobile, the pilot product of the first stage of commodity abundance, early 20th century, has left its mark on the landscape with the dominance of freeways, which tear up the old urban centers and promote an ever wider dispersal. Within this process, various forms of partially reconstituted urban fabric fleetingly crystallize around, quote, distribution factories, unquote. Giant shopping centers erected in the middle of nowhere and surrounded by acres of parking space. These temples of frenetic consumption are subject to the same irresistible centrifugal momentum, which casts them aside as soon as they have engendered enough surrounding development to become overburdened secondary centers in their own turn. But the technical organization of consumption is only the most visible aspect of the general process of decomposition that has brought the city to the point of consuming itself. Economics history, whose entire previous development centered around the opposition between city and country, has now progressed to the point of nullifying both. As a result of the current paralysis of any historical development apart from the independent movement of the economy, the incipient disappearance of city and country does not represent a transcendence of their separation, but rather their simultaneous collapse. The mutual erosion of city and country, resulting from the failure of the historical movement through which existing urban reality could have been overcome, is reflected in the eclectic mixture of their decomposed fragments that blanket the most industrialized regions of the world. I'm going to keep reading to the end of this chapter, and then we can discuss all we want. The universal history was born in cities, and it reached maturity with the city's decisive victory over the country. For Marx, one of the greatest revolutionary merits of the bourgeoisie was the fact that it, quote, subjected the country to the city, unquote, whose very air is liberating. That's another quote. That's not a quote from Marx, however. That's a quote from medieval times, where serfs couldn't leave their land, but if they managed to escape their land and get to a city, some of the cities guaranteed their freedom. They couldn't be dragged back to the country again. So there was this, because of that, somebody said the very air of cities is liberating, you know, just to be there, because it was literally liberating. They didn't have to go back to their semi-slavery. But if the history of the city is a history of freedom, it is also a history of tyranny, a history of state administrations controlling not only the countryside, but the cities themselves. The city has been the historical battleground of the struggle for freedom, but it has yet to host its victory. The city is the focal point of history because it embodies both a concentration of social power, which is what makes social enterprises possible, and a consciousness of the past, which the countryside doesn't have. The current destruction of the city is thus merely one more reflection of humanity's failure thus far to subordinate the economy to historical consciousness, of society's failure to unify itself by reappropriating the powers that have been alienated from it. Next thesis. It opens with a quote from the German ideology, Marx and Engels. The country represents the complete opposite, from the city, isolation and separation, unquote. As urbanism destroys the cities, in other words, like now we don't have cities like we used to, where they were real centers of lively activity. Now you can be in the city and you're still alienated. You might as well be in the suburb practically. And if you're in the suburb, it's like you might as well be a peasant of, that's what he's talking about. As urbanism destroys the cities, it recreates a pseudo countryside, devoid both of the natural relations of the traditional countryside with peasants and so on, and of the direct and directly challenged social relations of the historical city. The conditions of habitation and spectacular control in today's so-called planned environment, unquote, have created an artificial neo-peasantry. This neo-peasantry is people that live in cities who would look down on peasants, but it's like they've become like peasants. This geographical dispersal and the narrow-mindedness that have always prevented the peasantry from undertaking independent action and becoming a creative historical force are equally characteristic of these modern producers, people who live in cities, who go on the subways and so on, for whom a world of their own making is as inaccessible as were the natural rhythms of work in agrarian societies. It's something they didn't make, it's just they found themselves in there. Now, most people in the cities find themselves in a thing where you got to take the subway to go to work, and you got to or you drive to all that. The peasantry was the steadfast foundation of so-called Oriental despotism, the Oriental empires, in their inherent its inherent fragmentation of the peasantry gave rise to a natural tendency toward bureaucratic centralization, which the peasants couldn't really do anything about. The neo-peasantry, produced by the increasing bureaucratization of the modern state, differs from the old peasantry in that its apathy must now be historically manufactured and maintained. Natural ignorance has been replaced by the organized spectacle of falsifications. So the old peasants were sort of naturally apathetic. They didn't give a shit about the emperor and all that because they didn't know anything about it. They just hoped that they wouldn't get taxed too much, etc. They didn't know all this other stuff going on. Now the modern neo-peasants in the cities here in New York and Tokyo and London, etc., don't have that excuse. We could be knowledgeable, but by just swallowing TV and swallowing the mass media and swallowing this and that, most modern urban people are not much more literate than the most backward hick peasant. But in this case, their apathy, their ignorance has been historically manufactured by the spectacle. They had to be sort of drawn there. It didn't come with the deal. The new cities inhabited by this technological pseudo-peasantry are a glaring expression of the repression of historical time on which they have been built. Their motto could be, quote, "Nothing will ever happen here, and nothing ever has." You go to Paris or something like this, or other places in Europe, and you say, gosh, this thing was here in the Middle Ages, this street and all that. But if you go to modern cities, like most in the United States and elsewhere, it's true. Nothing ever happened here. Maybe something happened in this place 100 years ago, but you wouldn't know about it. It's just a parking lot now. And the forces of historical absence have begun to create their own landscape because historical liberation, which must take place in the cities, has not yet occurred. The history that threatens this twilight world could potentially subject space to a directly experienced time. Proletarian revolution is this critique of human geography through which individuals and communities will be able to create places and events commensurate with the appropriation no longer just of their work, but of their entire history. The ever-changing playing field. So here's one of the few places in this book where you get a little glimpse of the future, the possible future. The ever-changing playing field of this new world, where humans have dominated it instead of being subject to it, and the freely chosen variations in the rules of the game will regenerate a diversity of local scenes, like it used to be in the old days, that are independent without being insular, thereby reviving the possibility of authentic journeys, journeys within an authentic life that is itself understood as a journey containing its whole meaning within itself. That's what I was talking about in that Joy of Revolution thing I was reading last time. This diversity and all this kind of. Final thesis. The most revolutionary idea concerning urbanism is not itself urbanistic or technological or aesthetic. It is the project of reconstructing the entire environment in accordance with the needs of the power of workers' councils, of the anti-state dictatorship of the proletariat, of executory dialogue. Such councils, which can be effective only if they transform existing conditions in their entirety, cannot set themselves any lesser task if they wish to be recognized and to recognize themselves in a world of their own making. So that's the end of that chapter. And now let's see if you have comments or questions. Yes, Peter.
Yeah, a couple. I mean, just, this chapter is so rich. There's just so much to talk about. But the two that I think I want to highlight is when he talks about tourism and just my experience as somebody who's traveled and loves to travel. When you go to places like Venice or, even Paris, a lot of it is just so fake now because it's all built for the tourist industry. What capital has done is taken these places. There aren't any Venetians that live in Venice anymore. You go there and you pretend like it's still Venice because you want to see what it was like, and the buildings are still there. No one's there. And so you chase authentic experiences, right? Capitalism pushes us to chase these geographically authentic experiences. And even that's an industry now. How do you find these places that locals still go to, and then you find them and they're not real anymore? So it's like this geography of capitalism has just made everything the same. And then with the way that cities are made, like I grew up in the suburb in the 80s, and it was all, I kind of understood what it was, but without understanding until I started to read Marx and like all this urbanist stuff, and just realizing how isolated I was, I think was the first thing. It's like I'm living next to all these people and no one talks to each other, and they're all isolated. There's no place, there's no sidewalks, there's no place for us to actually get together. And even moving to a city, then I think you were saying it's like it's still the same thing. Like I don't know my neighbors. I don't know who they are. And when people want better stuff, it's never something unique. It's like we want a coffee shop, we want some, big business to come in, and it's all the same. It's like there's no we're not doing anything like Debord is saying, like that individualizes, authenticizes stuff. We can't in capitalism, but it's just like when things get developed, it's here comes Starbucks,
Yeah. We have this thing with nostalgia, which is sometimes delusory, but it's actually true that, I remember when I came to Berkeley in 1965, And man, was it different. Berkeley's still kind of an interesting place, you know, for it's kind of carried over. But then I could just, not everywhere, but if I went on Telegraph Avenue or some of the places kind of in that, you know, near the university and so on, I mean, you could just walk down the street and people would be debating on the street corners. And they were talking about, these were people that had been in the free speech movement 6 months earlier. And they're debating about, should we vote for this, or should we have a sit-in here, or should we do this, or so-and-so says this. I mean, all this stuff was going on, you know, with the counterculture and with the new left that were sort of, you know, actually conjoined, but, you know, they each had their different things. And there were cafes where it was not a prestigious, you know, it was not like, oh, this, you know, a snobby kind of thing. It's just that there were cafes where you would just see people there all the time. Oh, I go there and there's 5 people that I know are there. And it's not that they're there all the time, but it's just that people are coming and going. There was a guy who was in the free speech movement. So, I mean, that's, of course, a more exceptional thing. But he said, remember, the free speech movement in Berkeley was characterized by, they're sort of revolting against the university as a knowledge factory kind of thing, you know, being treated as a punch card or something like this. So they were saying, well, we want, you know, and it had to do with civil rights and stuff like that. We do some concrete thing, and here's this big anonymous university sends, no, you're not permitted there, or something. And so this
Mario Savio.
Yeah, right. So this guy who was a friend of Mari Savio's, I forget his name right now, but somebody who was right kind of in the key people who were there. He said that even though that was the case, you know, that kind of alienation, he said during the free speech movement, I think that I knew at least as a nodding acquaintance, 1,500 people. You know, in other words, he might not even know their name, but he said, oh, that guy, yeah, I've seen him around a dozen times. He was at that, he gave that thing, you know,
Yeah.
And you just, when you were doing stuff, you know, you remember, oh, yeah, I know you. Hey, how's it going? You know, even if you forgot their name or something, you'd know them. You could say, okay, this is a good guy. You know, we're cool. I'm thinking about that 1,500 people. I mean, he had sort of sat down. I don't know if he counted, but he was just saying, well, yeah, I know hundreds of people, you know, and then said, actually, I know more than hundreds. I know 50. Yeah, you know, just sort of as a general thing. And that was something like in another year, before or after, maybe you'd come as a student to Cal and you would know 10 people. And you'd see a few other people around because they were in your class or something, but yeah, you know, totally different experience. And so I've had that kind of experience both ways. And so you do see what he's talking about. I mean, Debord's had that experience in Paris 1953 compared with Paris 1970, et cetera. That even for him, he'll say, well, you know, in his last film, 1978, which maybe we'll see later, he has a thing, he's talking about these days in Paris, and he's saying right now, Paris no longer exists. And that was 1978. It's like almost 50 years ago. He's already saying, forget it. It's not here. I mean, okay, he's exaggerating, but he's saying that the real Paris does not exist anymore. And he's kind of hyperbolically, he's saying it's just a bunch of bullshit now. And that's happened in like a space of 25 years. You know, that things have been torn down and whole neighborhoods are no longer there anymore, et cetera, which has its own effect on the rhythm of people's lives. You know, if if these places are torn down pretty soon, yeah, you still have some cool places, some pretty buildings, some kind of nice, whatever art things or something, but they're isolated. They're the things that the tourist thinks is, oh yeah, come to the Louvre and see the Mona Lisa, and oh, that cafe, that's where Sartre used to hang out with, da da da, and yeah, it's still the same cafe there, but humanly speaking, it doesn't mean shit. It's just the same building, like right now, people who work there wouldn't even know who those people were who made it,
Hey,
that hung out there
you
all.
take a picture with it, and that's all you do.
Yeah,
at this
You
point.
say, look at this. This is Les Deux Magots or whatever it was,
Yeah.
Okay, anyway, thanks. Dave Blake, unmute yourself. Are you still there, Dave? Yes.
I just wanted to give a nod to those fine capitalists at Pixar who made the movie Shrek 2, in which Shrek saves Iona from the dragon who's sleeping, and they run away, and the dragon follows them, breathing fire and almost getting them a number of times. And they go by a city, and trying to hit them, the dragon sets on fire a Starbucks, and everybody in the Starbucks goes running out across the street into another Starbucks.
Thank you. John Salt.
Yes, this is kind of an observation, maybe more than a question, but especially when it comes to the word technology, which I come upon once in a while here, I notice that he's written this in 1967. We're in 2024. There's nothing in this book that I can understand. I mean, it's very abstract in some ways, and you've unpacked it beautifully, but there's nothing that I've read and understood that I would counter. It all makes total sense. And then I have this sense of collapsed time between then and now, as if he's talking to me now, and I'm saying, yeah, that is the society as you're portraying it.
Oh.
And then I have this sense of, what the hell? You were 57 years ahead of your time with this prescience, this kind of uncanny idea. It's the wonder I feel. And especially, for example, with the AI that we're dealing with now. And when he comes up with this in 173, the contradiction between the growth of society's material powers and the continued lack of progress towards any conscious control of those powers, as revealed in any third one is genetic modification, where the possibility of manipulating heredity is already on the horizon, as you mentioned. So the idea that we can't constrain any of these powers, he's already seeing that then, and now it's like at a critical moment. And I have this kind of feeling of vertigo between the two times, and how can he have these kind of understandings? And then I have this yearning to wish, what if he were alive, what would he tell us now? I don't know, I think he would just flip out. If he flipped out at this point, what would he do now? Anyway, it's very stimulating, and I thank you for everything.
Yeah, my feeling is like when we were talking about psychogeography earlier, and somebody was saying, well, what is this going on? My feeling is that because Debord lived like he did, and thought, experimented like he did, this enables you to be more perceptive, I think. And you can see tendencies, even though this is you can start talking about kind of things that may seem sort of science fiction-ish or 1984-ish or whatever, and just kind of speculating what would it be to be completely controlled or to be completely this or that. But you can see them, or he could see this more lucidly. And I don't want to make a big deal about him, because I think this applies for anybody who does a little bit of that, is that your eyes are cleared a little bit, and you can see, you don't have to see, I mean, obviously it takes some intelligence to project how this tendency will carry out. But if you see a tendency toward a certain kind of bureaucratization or scientification or whatever these various things may be, basically what you're seeing, this whole book, this spectacle, we think of it as images and all this kind of thing, but as I hope has become clear, he's not really talking about images. He's talking about things that are separate from us, that are out of our control. There's a disconnect. And an easy way to envision that is that here we are and there we're watching the movie or TV or here we are and the leader is telling us, those kind of separate. But all kinds of separations is what he's talking about, which is what Marx was talking about too, actually, when he talks about commodity and all this stuff. And so when you have that sense, this is stuff that for its own logic, it has its own kind of mechanistic rationale about how these things developed. Like if money does this, then people will become richer doing this, which will lead to competition here, which will lead to monopoly here, which will lead to war here, which will lead to starting over the capital. You can kind of see where things are tending, so that it's not like you see, 30 years from now, they'll be doing this, because maybe 30 years from now, it could have been much worse or much better. Maybe there's a revolt or something. But you can see the tendencies there that you can then start talking about, even though when you look around you, if you looked around you in 1960 in many of these places, you said, well, what is he talking about? The city is dominating this kind of thing. I mean, here's a vacant lot over here, and here's stuff going on over here. And, but he's seeing, look at that building over there. Look at that project. So far, it's the only one in Paris. But where did that come from, and where's that going? Let me tell you, we're going to see more of those buildings just because somebody's making money off of them and they serve to there's no downsides from the capitalist angle or something, or if there are downsides, they don't care because they're making money, or for whatever the factors may be, you can kind of see where that's moving. Like Vanagem, the other most notable situationist guy, talked about the cybernetic welfare state in early 60s. And back in the early 60s, most people didn't even know what cybernetics was and what the hell does that mean, a cybernetic welfare state. But he used that as, this is a threat. This is where we're going if we don't cut it off at the pass somewhere. And Debord is maybe using a little different lingo, but he's talking about the same kind of thing. He's talking about this thing where, you get welfare, so it's kind of like a Brave New World sort of thing. It's less 1984-ish or something. And, but you can see the tendencies there. And now, of course, where everything's digitalized and all this, for good and ill, it's not as if it's, as you know, I'm a big fan of a lot of this stuff, but we can see the downsides of it is that everybody's glued to their cell phone or to this or that. They can use that for some interesting things, but there's an obvious tendency that everybody just sort of swallowed up in that. And it's kind of hard to fight against it, because what are you going to fight against? It's not like there's a building that can be bombed or destroyed or something. What you have is people's habits, customs, technologies that can do, mixed in with old-fashioned stuff like police and armies and so on, if needed be, but it can be subtler like that. And you can see that people can be just sort of trained, so that they're going to assume that, skyscrapers and parking lots that have 100,000 parking places and are just how it should be. Where else would we put the cars? Look, what do you need the car? Well, we need the cars to get around. You're not just going to stay at your home, are you? You know, and you've forgotten that you could walk or you could have trains or bus. Yeah, you know, you just get used to these certain kinds of things. And it's not just a mental thing because physically it's there. You can't get used to cutting across town because there's a building in the way. You have to go around here and make sure it's the one way, and you've got to watch out for traffic and you know, you can't do stuff like you might have been able to do a century ago. Not that it was that meaningful a century ago, but if you did it, you had more of a sense of the actual geography of something. And so
Thank you.
enough on that. Thank you for bringing that. Dan Rogers, please unmute yourself.
Sure, thanks. So yeah, I guess I just want to start by saying I'm in, you know, broad sympathy with Debord's account of urbanism and architecture, but I wanted to point out there's a counter argument which I think deserves to be aired, which is sort of emphasizes the benefits of modern planning, sort of mid-century, mid-20th century modern planning for improving the living standards of, you know, the working classes and even the poor. And I think so. The Marxist geographer David Harvey, I think, makes this argument in his book, The Condition of Postmodernity. And yeah, it related to that is the question of architecture and style. And so how, yeah, certainly I would agree that, you know, we've seen just a ridiculous amount of horrible boxy architecture, you know, in the last 100 years, but a lot of that was sort of a lot of that is sort of cheap knockoffs of a more noble style, like the international style, right? Which was, you know, you could argue for or against that broadly, but at least in its more refined examples, it's a bit nicer to look at. Just another thing that comes to mind is this, in this vein, is there was a famous housing project in St. Louis built in the 50s called the Pruitt-Igoe project, and it was designed by the same architect that designed the World Trade Center in New York, Minoru Yamasaki. And it was famous, among other things, for being, I think, the first housing project to be demolished. I think it was demolished like in the 70s or something. It had become infamous for just a really low standard of living, and a lot of people just blame modernist architecture for the declining quality of life that became more evident there. There's a documentary that's been made trying to portray that explanation as a myth. So it's called the Pruitt-Igoe myth, and it's pretty interesting, and it really talks about the broader economic decline of St. Louis and Rust Belt cities in general, as where we should look at. But I think Debord is very helpful in trying to show the intertwinement of these things, and certainly like the mass production of boxes upon boxes and the draining of life, you know, in urban cities and in the countryside are certainly phenomena that are undeniable. But yeah, just thought I'd point that out.
No, you know, when I use these examples or when other people raise them, I don't mean that it's cooler to go back to like the 19th century where blah, blah. I mean, 19th century Paris was horrible, for example. And yet that's the thing that we kind of romanticize. I mean, you talk about unhealthy slum, you know, but the point is, despite that, there was a popular culture of, you know, a working class culture that was not spectacularized. I mean, the spectacle wasn't, you know, people in this miserable condition, nevertheless, they related. there was a community, you know, all this, for example. But that doesn't mean that that's where to go. It's just that you can look at that and contrast that with something else that came in a century later, where somebody, for example, in Paris, there was a thing where in more recent times, there were some big buildings that were put in replacing the old things. And they said, well, this is more, you know, these old buildings were unsanitary and blah, blah. They were tiny little apartments and so on. But part of the flaw of that argument is says, well, you don't think that people live in their apartments, do you? No, they lived in the cafes, dummy. They spent all their time in their cafes and then they went home and crashed. You know, and so they tear down that stuff, cafes and apartments, put in this new thing that has more snazzy stuff and is a lot more expensive, so nobody can afford it. But if they can afford it, it's just this like a motel room or something like that. And then there's no community anymore. Where'd the cafes go? And somebody would say, oh, well, there's a Starbucks half a mile down that way. You know, there used to be like one on every corner, you know, and that was where people would hang out. Again, I'm not praising it. I mean, to me, it seems pretty miserable, frankly. But you know, it's like Debord is so he's not talking about either or. What he and the other situationists were talking about, some of whom were architects and, you know, were kind of inventive, was that there's all kinds of other possibilities. We don't have to choose like, well, was this big building? Well, it was there because people needed a place to, you know, as the thing of unitary urbanism, one of the theses says, it's a blackmail that says we need these buildings because people need a place to sleep. Well, unarguable, right? Don't people need to play? Yeah, but they don't, you know, there's 100 different ways you could deal with that. And the reason that you deal with it in big boxes is because we're in capitalism. You know, the people who lived there didn't say, I want to live in a big box. Nobody ever said that, you know. So, Ed, unmute yourself. Ed Stress.
Yes, hi, we're winding down here. Well, we have a really big example here, and I'm wondering what people that live in my town think of this example. And there's a big housing boom in Berkeley. Last I heard, there were 18 sites. I think we've gotten a couple more on 18 active building sites in Berkeley, and I think we've gotten a few more on since then. And then to answer the question, what do we do? Well, there's city council meetings. And they're pretty alienating, but I'm wondering what people think of, are we doing a good job in Berkeley? Berkeley's supposed to be special. Is this an example of like 90% pretty good housing, or is this an example of 90% spectacle? I'm just wondering what the people who live here think of what we're doing now.
Well, a lot of people I know don't like that stuff, but it seems that many of the city council people are more or less in the pockets of developers. So
Like
they
that.
keep coming up with these things. And of course, they can always justify it by saying, well, wait a minute, we've allotted, this will have room for 100 homeless people or something, you know, kind of little things tacked in like that, you know, and so you're not supposed to oppose it because it's supposed to be helping homeless people. But
Yeah, the biggest one I've heard of is like 1/3 homeless, and we've got to have this other money in to pay for it. A lot of these people are graduates of the planning department of the urban development. I don't know exactly what department it is on campus. Probably city planning department, and I want to tap in. Some of them are personal friends, and we have arguments, but not very substantial ones. I just was at a city council meeting where they're going to use the whole property at the Ashby BART station for high rises, and I'm just wondering how different that's going to be from the urban renewal of the 60s. I mean, a lot of people there are saying, well, we had urban renewal that took away all the black interesting neighborhoods, and now we're going to put urban renewal and put them back. Um, when I was in college, I was on a construction site building an urban renewal project in Baltimore, and like I think 20 years, 15 years later, that was a big deal, tearing it down because it was blighted. Well, I don't seem to have any criteria for what would be a good plan.
Well, this is the society we live in makes it difficult to have any good criteria that doesn't run into some problem.
There's,
You can say, well, what are we going to do about the homeless? Okay, well, you need to build places for that. But then as long as you have to account for the fact that we're in a capitalist society where some people own are billionaires and other people don't have any money, the billionaires are going to come out on top in most cases. And the only difference will be that there will be some jostling in the mid-range about some things that make it look more humanistic, like, oh, we'll have some things for homeless people here, or X number of this. But meanwhile, the whole thing, tends, just like Debord keeps saying, it tends towards banalization. It tends towards, repeating, just the ugly, cheap building. And what's important is to keep people separated and to keep people quiet. So if you can just sort of shove them in a sardine can and tell them not to, then you don't really have to worry, because it's hard to organize anything or even to imagine anything from that kind of place. Judy.
well, let me just finish. The way I look at it, the reason there's homeless is because they were kicked out by their landlords to make room for the next tier to come in, because there's people at the top that want the most rich places, so they
Right.
take the places, and then on the bottom they're kicked out. I mean, we don't have a fertility thing where we're greater than when the births are a lot greater than the deaths in Berkeley. So I don't know where this huge group of people, they're not mostly coming from outside, they say, they were kicked out by their landlords, and that's what we're doing.
Judy, unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah, I think the problem is, and I think it was a problem from the time Bill Clinton passed the trade agreements, is that money trumps everything. The force of money is stronger than government. It's stronger than anything. And I don't know if the Situationists ever really got to that point, but right now it's such a powerful force in society. I don't know what you do about it, because
You
money,
overthrow capitalism. That's what.
yeah, money is everything. Money is more powerful than government. It tells government what to do, basically.
Yeah, yeah. And that's been true. That was true 200 years ago with Marx and in that era. So, I mean, that's what's talking about there. Mike Bellard.
The question of money comes up a lot, and I just want to point out that Marx demystified money as just being another commodity that you use to trade other commodities, and the commodity has to always have socially necessary labor time embodied in it, and so that demystifies money. And so who owns the money also owns the socially necessary labor time, which, by the way, that abstraction is your life mostly. So that ownership leads to political power, and that is if you just take the time to read even the first chapter of Capital, Volume 1, and then go to Chapter 3, you'll see it just like the I hate to use this Christian stuff. No. The scales will fall from your eyes, and you'll see. It'll be demystified. I mean, that's the whole point of writing capital is to demystify. That's what Debord is trying to do, is demystify the goddamn thing. So anyway,
Yeah.
thanks for the session.
Yes, and I want to thank you all. We're running over a little time here, but I think we had a lot of good discussion here, and we managed to get our way through this territorial management chapter that I think is a very interesting one. So we will just keep plugging away. I'll just I'll send an email tomorrow, but it will be that we have 2 more chapters. There's this large chapter called something about, is it about negation and consumption within culture, and then there's a final short chapter called the ideology materialized. So anyway, we'll be discussing the first part of the one about culture, and that's interesting in a lot of different ways here. So I'll look forward to seeing you all 2 weeks from now. Thank you once again.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.
Stop
Okay.
them.
Very good. See you, everybody.
And I'm going to stop the recording.